Okay, cool. So guys, today we will be talking about WSDL SOAP API services in Salesforce, how to integrate these services, how to deal with a SOAP API with a SOAP service, and how to make a request and get data using a WSDL file through a SOAP service. So as you all know, in Salesforce we have like different type of services. We can create our service as either a live service, as HTTP service, or as a SOAP service. Basically, we use, as you know, HTTP service if we are making a RESTful API. RESTful API, like if we have JSON request, JSON response, HTML, or it's the latest, service. I'll say legacy services are still using SOAP type. Now, what we'll be talking and focusing about today is the SOAP service. So our service today will be basically a service that I did implement for a kind of project, and we'll be sharing with you how to do that. We'll implement that together and see how to deal with the SOAP service, with the WSDL, etc., etc. We come to these things step by step. Someone maybe I think joined. Let me admit. I think everyone here is joined, because I just heard Zoom voice. I thought that someone new joined. Okay, to start right now, we'll be doing a service called B2B credit check integration. It's basically a service that we're going to perform when the user does a checkout for his products through the checkout page. We'll be calling a SOAP service. We'll be receiving a response, and based on the response, the user will be able to place an order. Someone else joined.
Okay. Amer, don't worry about it. I'm taking care of admitting them.
Oh, okay. Okay, you're the host. Okay, cool. Now let's start. We'll be creating a new service. We're gonna call it B2B credit check. So this is the name of the service. I already created that. I have it already created, but to show you, we call it B2B credit check. We will choose the type as SOAP. The service mode will be live because it's a real data service, not a mock service. And we will have to create a credentials for sure for this service and a profile for that. I have already created the profile and the credentials. So the credentials is basically gonna be a name and a URL. For the user and the password, they will be passed through a custom object. So we shouldn't be worrying about adding this data here. That's the URL of the service. And to see the URL in real world, that's the URL. It's basically a WSDL file. Now, as you see, a WSDL file is actually a large file that has a lot of requests that we can interpret and deal with to communicate with a third-party, service. If you go scroll, we're not gonna look into all of these details, but I just want to scroll all the way down to the WSDL to show you the part we care about here for the service. As you see below, we have CTO, we have the port and address for the service binding, the address binding. It basically defines the location where our XML request will go to. Because as you know, with SOAP service is always an XML request, in opposite of RESTful. RESTful could be JSON, as we mentioned, HTML. It can be also XML, which is not a good idea, but it can be. So this is the endpoint that we're going to be calling. It will show up at the end of the WSDL file. Now, the first step, actually, I would recommend before we start going into coding is to download SOAP UI application. It will help us analyze the WSDL file and generate the request methods that we're going to be dealing with. So it will help a lot in doing the implementation. Also, another extension I recommend is Chrome WSDL, Chrome WSDL extension. This basically, if you click here, that's the extension we have. As you see, it will basically tell us give us all the methods that are available through this WSDL. All of these methods are basically methods that will perform a request to that service address that we mentioned below here, which is defined in the location. So in our example, we will be implementing the report request. We will be calling this method and sending a request and getting the corresponding response for that. If we click on the report, it will basically generate for us the XML template of the SOAP request. Any SOAP request, you can easily define and tell that this is a SOAP request by looking into the XML. Always, a SOAP request will have a tag called envelope, which will have a body and a header section. It's not mandatory to have the header, but it could have a header section as well. I'm not talking about this header. This is related to our request, but I'm talking another header tag here. So to show you a better example, how will we will right now use SOAP UI to generate our XML template that will give us a description about the request we're going to send. So let me go to the path, my WSDL file. That WSDL file, by the way, is I have downloaded this WSDL file locally in the laptop, and because we will be using that for sure. So let's go to the desktop and see credit check service. I think I need to go all the way here. So credit. Yeah, that's it. Now, after we're creating a new SOAP project, we click OK, and that will load everything we just saw. All the methods I saw you through the Chrome extension, which is just it's something that will help you generate things quickly, but always SOAP UI is the choice if you want to do the implementation, because it's much better than that Chrome extension. It has a lot of details. We'll be doing the report request. So if we expand this report request, then double click on request one. As you see, the SOAP UI will generate the whole request template for us. That's all the parameters that this request can take. And I wanted to show you a quick example how we can do this request. We can do it through SOAP, of course, or through Postman. So I did it. I prepared the template and added some dummy data for that to show you how to perform the SOAP request from the template through the Postman. So as you see, I just filled data here. It's the data that the API expects. Then you click send, and we get that response. Now, as you see, we get a response. We don't care right now what is the response. We care about the process. Now, in Salesforce, once we want to do the request, there are two methods. There is always the best practice, which is we will be following. But just FYI, there is also another practice. It's not a good practice, bad practice. But I can basically build this XML object in Salesforce just using normal variables or normal string. For example, I can do such like this, var XML object of type XML, and then open my tags. And this way I defined all of my data. But this will work. But the bad practice about this thing is you will be, first of all, you will be storing XML objects in the memory, which is a very bad thing because XML objects are very big data. They might cause memory leak, and sometimes they might cause quota issues. So this is not an approach we're going to be following. But in case we want to apply this method, we want to do it like this way, just like I did. We cannot define our service as a SOAP service. We need to define our service as an HTTP service, and just convert the whole thing here to a string, then send that request. As a result, we'll get a response, and we'll get a response, an XML response that we can parse and we can go with it. But as I mentioned, that's a bad practice. We need to think of another way to do it. Now, the correct way of doing this in Salesforce is following an approach that is actually highly detailed there in the documentation. Now, first thing, there is a package called DWS. We need to import this package. WS stands for Web Preferences. Now, all SOAP services are interacted through an object called Web Preferences 2. So there is an object that this Web Preferences 2, it comes from DWS package. Any SOAP service needs to be interpreted with this object, Web References 2, because this object basically it points to the whole WSDL file, and it will generate for us all the Java classes and the methods that we can use to deal with our SOAP service. So in Salesforce, generally, there are two objects. There is Web References and there is Web References 2. Now, there's what's the difference between these Web References 2 and Web References, which is basically just like that, without the 2. That Web References is used for RPC calls. So RPC calls basically are a type of SOAP services, WSDL files. Always, WSDL files is either an RPC call type or a document style type. I'm not going into details with RPC. I did not work on it briefly, but just what we need to know that if we are dealing with RPC code, we cannot use Web References 2. RPC, we need to use the Web References object. But in our case, we're dealing with a document style, which is a better document format than the Web References. So first thing will be to initialize our service that we created, which is B2B credit check. We just created that in Business Manager, as you saw here, B2B credit check. Now, the skeleton of the service, we all know, we have 4 callbacks. Init service client. This is the place where we generate, we will call our Web References to, and we will generate our SOAP classes in Java. This is a create request. It's the hook of the callback that will be called once the user make the request. And this the execute, we will be call that once the request object is ready and we want to perform the actual request. So at the create request, we create the request object, we wrap it, we create the shape of it. Then we call our request in the execute function. And once we get a valid 200 successful response or 201 or any kind of success code responses, a response will be called, and we can parse our data and define the shape of the data we want and return. Now, this mock call, we don't care about that one. I just created that for testing. It's if we want to test mock data, if we don't have a real data service and we just need to do a mock data code, and we always want to return, for example, a specific shape just to test some feature. So we're not gonna care about this part. So now, before we call this, we need to know the method names. For example, first line we need to do, we need to import the package dw.ds and call our WSDL file. Now, it's a very simple process. We define a variable. I defined that variable into this object, into service, because I want to use it in other methods. And we will say web references to dot credit check service. What is a credit check service? It's the WSDL file name. It should exactly match the WSDL file name, which it must be placed under web references to folder. We need to create, first step here, we need, before doing this line, we need to create a new folder under our cartridge, which will be called web references 2. So if we go expand app Birkenstock here, cartridge, we'll find that we have web references 2 and the credit check service.wsdl, which is exactly the file name of the web references 2. At this step now, we have made a pointer to our WSDL, and for the initial time that service run, it will start loading. It will just take time. The first time you run your service, it will take some time because it will go and generate a lot of Java classes, all the WSDL Java classes, and they will be basically all pointed by my object, credit check service. Now the question is, before I start implementation, I mentioned that we need to know our Java classes. How could we get some documentation, or because it's hard to read the WSDL and I need to deal with the Java methods and Java classes. How can I generate these methods? So if in Eclipse through UX Studio, if you go to this icon, the digital server, click on the arrow, then download web service API, we get the dialog of the WSDL file. We click browse. Then under app Birkin stock, it will show me the web references too. I will pick my WSDL and define, let's make a new folder. For example, we're gonna call it credit check WSDL classes. And okay, click OK. Now it will start generating things, and once we go, so yeah, this error, don't worry about this error. It's basically it generated all the classes, but there is no documentation generated. This is due to some JDK or GRE in my machine. This is fine. Let's go to the folder and let me show you what was generated. So we said credit check. What was the file name? Let me go through here. Credit check WSDL. So excuse me, let me credit check. Service. Yeah, that's it. So these are, if you see here, all of these files are Java files that I generated. So what I mentioned, what we needed from these ones, we need to create a report request. So we go back to these files. Once we reach the step we're using it, let me comment this line. Basically, we need to get the service and return it here in the initialization. The only parts we need to do in the initialization are these basic 3 lines. First line is to generate the classes and point them by our object through web references. Then we need to return the service, which will we use in the create request. First line, let's set the authentication as none, as we don't need an authentication for this service. And second line here, now here we go to, and we will start using our WSDL Java classes that we generated. Now, it could be a little bit confusing first time when I say like var object factory, I just defined a variable and just created a new instance like this dot credit check service, which I defined here, dot object factory. So where did I get this from? That could be confusing if I'm not generating my stuff to get like basic indication of what of the objects I have. So if we basically search for object factory in the Java, we'll find that we already have that class. And we can open this file. It's taking some time. Okay. Okay, it's loaded here. So this object factory basically is just a wrapper. It's a factory method, abstract factory method that can create for us any method we want for any object in that WSDL. So we have two options. We said we want to do a report request, which if you look here, you will find something called report request. We have two options. We can either search for report request, open this file, and create a new instance. We can just say, you see that's the class documentation. You can find that this is the class. The data that it takes is a header, is also a body. The body is of type request body. It's the German, it's a German word, so it's just whatever that the type. It's basically a request object with header and body. So we have two methods. I could have done it like this way. I could have said var report request equal new this dot report request, and basically creating this object, then starting doing report request dot get header, for example, get header or set header. I can just use this object and create a get header and get body using that new object. But if I want to follow the best practices from software engineering or object-oriented programming, I should always create one instance, which is the object factory. And through object factories, I will use methods to create my needed objects or to get my needed data without the need to always call in new. We can make things much more like readable. So first thing I did is defining the object factory that I will be using to do my request. Now from this object factory, I have called create report request. Now this create report request, as I mentioned, if we want to know how did I get this method name, I go back to the object factory.java, just search for that, and here we go. It's basically, it's in the end of the day, this method will do the job for me, will create a new report request instead of me doing this line in my code. So I created a report request using the object factory. Then the object factory, I will be using it for creating the header and body. Why I'm creating the header body, again, just to make sure we're on the same page, it's because that's the request parameters. We have header for the report request, we have body. The header has communication language, transmission timestamp, key list version, etc., etc. The same for the body. So the point of doing that get and set things is to set up the whole object, all of this, the object with all data should be set before I submit it to the WSDL or to the endpoint that is defined below or here above or defined below in the WSDL file. So let's go back. I got my header through object factory, created request header, then created request body for the body, and again, just if you search for them, you will find them all here in the object factory. So I don't need to worry about that. Now, next step is to set the attributes. Which are these attributes actually? We need to set these attributes, and we need to set these attributes. For example, communication language. I created my header. Let's comment these lines out, uncomment them. Now, as you see, set communication language, set a transmission timestamps. All of these methods can be found under the type trans request header, under the header request object. So we can just go here, search for that in our generated, right? It's in the report request. Okay, I need this data type. Okay, that's it. You will see that we have all the methods we are using in the header. If we start from the beginning in the header, there is, for example, set general password. If you set here, if you look here, you will find set general password. You will find set individual password. You will find any data you want. Now, yeah, if you look here, it could be confusing. You find that there are a lot of data here, as you see. But in this file that I opened, there are just only data for the general and individual password. That's because there's another class that is extended. If you look at the file here, called tabstract header. So this actually, we need to look for this part, and we will find all of these methods. All of these data is generated. So that's the other file. We open this file. Okay, that's the one already opened. Then the other one. Here we go. Now, set communication language, set transmission timestamp. It takes a calendar value, set key list version, etc. We go back to the Eclipse, and that's exactly what you have seen in the Java. Header, set communication language, set timestamp, set, and all of these values, I'm reading all of these values through a custom object that I created. You don't care about this part of detail because you can, it depends on the service you're implementing. You can set the data from any place you want. You might have it hard-coded, you might have it from custom preference, it depends. So I set all the header data, then the same for the body. I set all the body data and did the same for, now I need to put my header and body in the report request, because as you saw here, we have a header and we have a body. And as we saw in the report request Java, we need to set the header, we need to set the body. So we can have this object report request ready for us. Now, cool things, my request is ready to go. I'm gonna return it. Now, next step will be to send this request. So to send this request, there is the callback execute that is called for the service. We just need to do service client. Now, .report was, what is report? As if you remember earlier, when we explained the WSDL structure, we said that we're going to be calling the report request, which is basically what we saw under SOAP UI here as report. So what we are calling is a report request. And these things, what you see here, are basically methods, just pure methods. So what I'm doing here is just calling the method name report and sending the report request that I have prepared here all the way. Now, as part of that, we have sent our request. Next step will be to parse our response. Now, same for the response. We need to get the response structure from the WSDL. So basically, we'll get a response. The response will be in this shape. It's that's the response actually from Postman. It has a lot of data. It has a header. It has a body. So this is a header, and this is the body. And through all of these data in the service I implemented, we just cared about one attribute, which is color designation, white or black. The feature was basically, if I'm getting a white, then my credit card is valid, or my payment, or this customer, this user who placed the transaction is a valid customer, he's not a fraud, then he can go ahead and place the order. If I get a black, then I threw an error to the in the checkout, telling the customer, hey, the payment could not happen, for example, because the data can't be validated, the customer can't be validated, whatever. So we just saw the response format here. And if we look at the WSDL, the SOAP UI, if we wanna look at the response format, what was the response format? Don't remember actually the class name, but it's a Trident West time. It's the same approach. So I got the body, I got the data I want, which is get report data, get risk judgment, get whatever data I get in the response. Based on the Java classes, as we mentioned, we can search for the response here. If you want to see it, then yeah, that's it. That's the response. Get a product type. We need, what method we used here was get report data. I think here, if we search for this, yes, we can find the report data. Now report data is of type report response body. So also same thing, I can search for this one here. Look here, that's the same file actually. I think that's the same file. This should be in the same file. Report data. It's of type report data. Okay. That's the report response. That's where I got my body and where I got my header, as you see here. Get body and get header. Now the report data, there will be something called report data, I assume. Yeah. Judgment. I don't remember what was the class name, but I will get there will be something called report data, the response. I'll get the risk judgment. I'll do get color. Then based on the color, I'll get a designation. If the designation is white, I'm good. If it's not white, it's black or whatever value, this customer is a fraud. Now, this is a parse response, so I don't need to send white or black to my controller or my helper method. So I just formatted my JSON JavaScript format, basically valid. If designation equal white, this means that it's gonna return valid as true, else it's gonna return valid as false. And that's gonna be it for the whole request and response service. Not sure if there is something else remaining. I think I covered like the whole flow of a SOAP request. But if you guys, if anyone has any questions, please go ahead and start asking. If I missed anything, if there is something unclear, I can clarify more. Do you hear me, guys?
Yes. Do you guys have any questions for Amer? Okay. Looks like that we actually don't have questions, but since we still have some time, and maybe some others might have some questions. I would like you, Qasrawi, to get into Business Manager and just let's talk a little bit more about all configurations we have under services on Business Manager, just to make sure this is clear for everyone.
Sure. Here is my service.
Okay, so yeah, so let's stop here for a minute. So whenever you're creating a service, the first thing you need to fill is the name. So in this case, Qasrawi is naming his service as B2B credit check. The second important option that you need to fill is the type. Could you please just expand this drop down, Qasrawi? So either if it is HTTP, HTTP form, FTP, SFTP, SOAP, or generic. In our case, we're using SOAP. SOAP web services, and Qasrawi has explained how you would be able to generate your objects through the WSDL, and how you would be able to configure the endpoint, how you would be able to create the request, what are the methods in the service configuration that you need to override in order to generate your request, send the request, and receive the response. You would be able to do the same, but with different methods for the HTTP or REST web services. Same thing you can do with SFTP, FTP, and HTTP form. And also there is generic way for web services, generic type for web services that's not covered as part of these options. What I would like to say is that under the Salesforce documentation, you would be able to understand the differences between all these types. Maybe in our next sessions, we might have another specific session for REST web services, but the focus today was on the SOAP web service. Okay, just to close this one, Qasrawi.
Just wanted to add a thing. You might have noticed I keep going through classes, and yeah, we from high level thinking point of view, I don't need to go walk through all the classes. I need to know all the documentation at once. So just remember that I had an issue with my machine generating the documentation, but in ideal case, a documentation will be generated if you have the correct JDK and JRE configured in your Eclipse. You will have one single documentation file that we can use to walk and get all your method names. You don't need to keep searching for the class names. You can find things much easier. But just it was my case, so just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, I agree. So the next attribute is called service mode. And this is very important actually, because in certain scenarios, the web service that you are communicating with might not be ready, or maybe it's you don't have the appropriate maybe endpoint, or it's not responsive. Maybe there is some kind of communication issues with the web service. So you had to do some kind of testing and start initial development, specifically if you know the structure of the returned response. So in the mocked web service, and this is actually the difference between the live service mode and the mocked service mode. So in the live service mode, you're actually communicating with the actual web service, with the live web service. So you're getting back live responses from the third party or from the web service that you are communicating with. But in the case of the mocked web service, there is a mocked method in the service configuration or the service registry class that you are writing. You can override a mock message or mock response. From that, you can just put any dummy response back, so that every time you request the endpoint, that mocked response actually is retained for you as a response, so that you would be able to move forward with your development until the service is ready, maybe, or until the service is maybe the communication is back and the connection is fixed. The next part actually is the log name prefix, and this is very important because this is actually being used in order to separate the log files generated from this web service. So each web service actually you would be able to review and see the actual request being sent to the endpoint and the actual responses you have received from the web service on specific log files. So when you provide, for example, in Qasrawi case here, he added B2P under dash credit at dash log, for example. This is the prefix of the web service name, and which you would be able to find it as part of the file name under the log files. Communication log enabled. If this is actually ticked, that means that you would like to log the actual requests being sent to the service and the actual responses being received from the web service in the log, so that you would be able to see this information. Forced production behavior in non-production environment. That means there are actually certain consideration for production environments. Not all messaging would be able to be logged. in certain scenarios in a production environment, there is no way you would be able to monitor the actual request being sent to web service or received from or a response is received from web service if you are in production, except if you are actually overriding a method called filtered message. So if you have to override that message and you provide your code, so that if there is sensitive data like credit cards and stuff like that, you have to encrypt those information. In production environment, if your service or if your web service actually is not overriding the filter message method, then you will never be able to review the request being sent to the web services and the responses retrieved from the web services. So when you check the forced production behavior in non-production environment, that means you will not be able to see the messages in the logs unless you actually overriding the filter message method. The profile and the credentials, these are actually configuration associated with this web service. And we will get into them since we still have a couple of more minutes. We will get into them and also explain the attributes associated with these profile and credentials. Could you please just open those, Qasrawi?
Yeah.
Amer?
Yeah, do you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we hear you.
Just get into the profile.
Yeah, I did. Didn't you see my screen right now on the profile page? This is the credentials page. This is the credentials page.
Let's just start with the credentials. So as we were set, as Qasrawi has shown you guys, this part actually of the credentials where you are able to fill the endpoint of your web service, the user and password. In Qasrawi case, he did not need actually to fill the user and password because he actually using custom preferences to retrieve the user and password. But usually you would be able to retrieve this information from these configurations using the credentials object, which is associated with the web service. So in this, go ahead.
Just wanted to highlight why in our case, for example, we did not use these ones. Actually, it was actually a custom object, not preferences. But the thing is that the password expires each month, so we needed a job that does another SOAP request to generate the new password before it expires. Then we update that in the custom object. So you might sometimes go to scenarios that you don't have a static password. That password needs to expire for security reasons. For example, I have a password that changes each, let's say, 30 days, and I don't need the business to go each 28 days and update that manually. So sometimes the service providers provide an endpoint to generate a new password, which we can use to build a new job that that updates that custom object password. In that case, we thought that it's going to be better to centralize all the data in the custom objects and update that data or password through that custom object. Because I'm not sure if we are able. I don't think we are able to modify user or service credentials through code in Business Manager. So in our case, it was better to have it in a custom object. That was just a scenario I wanted to bring because I forgot to talk about that. Are you listening, guys? Did you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
So I think that makes sense. Could you just go to the profile? Let's also walk through the profile attributes quickly.
Yeah, for sure. Right now, I'm not in the profile actually. Let me go to one step back. Just wanted to add something about also the credentials. It's very important that we create two credentials objects, one for the test environment and one for the live environment, because definitely in testing, usually you have different credentials for testing other than the production. And a business doesn't need to refill the data. He can just go to the service and change that credentials through the select box you just saw. So that's what you're gonna find for even for profile. You're gonna have a test one and you have live one.
Yes, that makes sense.
Here is the profile, Amer. You can go ahead.
Yes. So these attributes actually are also very important because they define some configurations related to the timeout, also the circuit breaker, and the rate limit. The connection timeout, you know, how much time in milliseconds this web service should wait before we receive the response before actually it breaks or it throws an exception. So this is, in your case, it's 10 seconds or 10,000 milliseconds. Enable circuit breaker. Circuit breaker means actually you see that there is, if you check it, you need to fill the circuit breaker calls and the circuit breaker interval. So it is actually the number of calls you are allowed to send for this web service within a specific interval. So you set the max circuit breaker calls, the number of the calls that are actually allowed to be sent to this web service in specific amount of milliseconds. The enable rate limit, it actually defines the maximum number of calls you are able to send to a specific web service and receive failed responses before it breaks, before it throws an exception. Which means in the rate limit, you define the number of allowed failures before an exception start to be thrown, definitely within a specific interval. So these actually are the meaning of both the profile associated with the service and the credentials. So every time you need to create a service, the first thing you do actually is that you create new service, as we've just showed you. After that, you need to also create a profile and associate it with your service. And you also need to create, the last thing, you need to create credentials and associate it with your service. And we have walked you guys through all these configurations. Do you guys have any other questions before maybe start looking into something else?
If you let me, Amer, I also wanted to add something I forgot to add. You remember we talked about the address location here. So for our service, for production, they provided us with two different WSDLs. Both WSDLs were exactly the same except the location. This is actually the KTU.online service. This is a test environment. And there's another location without KTU. I remember if I go online services here, that's the production WSDL. Okay, if I go scroll all the way down, that's without the KTU. So that was my endpoint for production. That was my endpoint for the test. Now the question is, we have two WSDLs here, and I mentioned that we need to place our WSDL in the web references to deal with, but we need to be careful that we don't need to place both of the WSDLs. Not because if the client have like provided two WSDLs, does not mean that we need to place both WSDLs, because all the functionality, all the methods were the same except for this line. And the beauty about Salesforce, actually, it doesn't read the URL of the request from the location here. That's something I tested, and so it read it from the credentials endpoint. So you can use either production or test, but usually what I noticed on other services, usually in coding, they use the test ones because just in case someone uses that WSDL, generated it through, let's say, not the service credentials, in some way turn around, they don't want the developer to deal with like production endpoints by mistake, by whatever. So they try always to put the WSDLs with the test environments, and I noticed that in all other WSDLs. Other than that, each endpoint had two WSDLs with only location difference, which we don't care about. We just need to take the test one, and in production credentials, we just take this value and add it there. But in the WSDL, we don't need to add more than the test WSDL. That's what I wanted to add. Other than that, as Amer mentioned, if you have any other questions before he moves to something else.
Okay. Okay. So two last things actually from my side. The first thing, if you could please just go into administration, development setup, and just get into the log files. Just want to show you guys the name of how the prefix being used as part of the name of the logging file for each service. So let's just highlight that as well.
Of course. I don't think you'll find this service because it's been a while since I've been in this project. So
yeah, we can look into others.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Just in the filter by name, just add service. Okay. Looks like you don't have.
I have something. I can show you something what you want. Let me just go to the staging logs. I have access to that.
Good.
Okay, here you go. A lot of services. For example, service PMG, avatax, gettax, IDEN. If you want
so just wanted to make sure you guys understand that how the log file prefix is being used when the log file is generated. So this is the first thing. The other thing that I would like to highlight is I would highly recommend you guys review Salesforce documentation around building SOAP web services and web services in general. You would be able also to cover on Salesforce documentation that some SOAP web services actually are associated with WS security. So you would be able to use Java key store for your web service before you start invoking it. In Qasrawi's case, actually, we did not need to do that. But in other scenarios, you might need to associate your request with a JKS file or a key store file in order to make so that the web service actually is able to send you back correct responses. So this is the first thing. And the second thing that I would like to highlight also, I would also recommend you guys review the authentication for web services in general. In Qasrawi case, the authentication was set, the authorization of the authentication was set to null. But there are actually other scenarios where you have to set the authorization in your code base, and this is very important topic that I would recommend you guys review it through the Salesforce documentation or the info center. And I remember actually that in the architect certification that I have taken, there was many questions about this specific topic. So it's very important you guys review it and understand it. And it's also important for any implementation to understand the differences between the authorization and when to set it null, when to populate this value, and this is well documented actually on Salesforce documentation, or what we call it info center. So that's it from my side. If you guys don't have any other questions, I would like to thank Amer Qasrawi for his time today. It was very helpful session, and stay tuned for the next session and some more interesting topics that we are going to cover with our upcoming sessions. Thank you all. Thank you very much. I really appreciate attending this session.
Thank you. Thank you very much,
guys.
Amer. Thank you,
So
everyone.
if you guys don't have anything, I was saying, if you guys don't have anything else to cover, we can end this session. Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.